Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for the panel Cancel Culture in Today's Literary Landscape, which is part of 1455's third annual summer festival. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455. I'm a writer, but way before that, I'm a reader, and like everyone I'm about to introduce, a literary advocate. So discussing writers, literary trends, what's going on, and how culture impacts art and vice versa has been an obsession of mine. So if we're going to have a 3-day festival focused on storytelling, it would seem silly to not at least attempt to talk about one of the bigger kind of current literary trends that's attracting a lot of attention, which is so-called cancel culture. There's so many ways to approach this conversation. I mean, one could focus on the cultural implications, what's going on at a very deep level within publishing. But what I wanted to do and have been able to do, fortunately, is assemble some experts who have decades of experience talking about culture and books and who are all writers themselves. So my goal is to be able to get some really interesting perspective and also put this in context in terms of where we've been and how much we need to pay attention to. Every generation has its crises and controversies, but right now I think this is really worthy of discussion. So let me introduce my distinguished guests, all of whom I'm honored to have here. Ladies first, I'll start with my good friend and fellow 1455 board member, Beth Ann Patrick, who is also known by her superhero moniker, The Book Maven, and you can follow her on Twitter, as many people do. Beth Ann is a writer, critic, and author whose career is focused on books, publishing, and authors, not necessarily in that order. She's been named one of FlavorWire's 35 writers who run the literary internet, and her book reviews appear frequently in the Washington Post, NPR Books, and others. She's a contributing editor to LitHub, where she writes the monthly column on overlooked books. We also have Marie Arana, who is a Peruvian-American author of nonfiction and fiction, as well as the inaugural literary director of the Library of Congress. She's the recipient of a 2020 Literary Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. For many years, which I can trace back as a big fan of Book World, she was editor-in-chief of Washington Post's book review section, Book World. Her sweeping history of Latin America, Silver, Sword, and Stone, was named Best Nonfiction Book of 2019 by the American Library Association. And among other books, she's published 2 prize-winning novels, Cellophane and Lima Nights. And last but not least, Eric Alterman. He is the Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. And from 1995 to 2020, he was the nation's liberal media columnist and is now a contributing writer to the magazine and also to the American Prospect, where he writes the weekly Altercation newsletter. He's a national bestseller of What Liberal Media? The Truth About Bias in the News, as well as 10 other books. Alterman is also a winner of the George Orwell Prize, the Stephen Crane Literary Award, and the Mirror Award for Media Criticism twice. So thank you all for being here. I can't wait to dive in. I think to kick things off, there is a high level and obvious question. It's always been incumbent for critics to separate the art from the artist. And I think that's something that's always perplexed, readers, fans, reviewers, and even the publishing industry. And a lot of times it's a posthumous assessment, but as we're seeing in an increasingly digital world, it's now more of a real-time thing that we have to deal with. But I think back on authors as diverse as William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor and in Hemingway, and how we approach some of these authors with today's lens versus what they did then, and that necessary contextualization, but also does the art and should the art just speak for itself? So I would love to start with Eric, because really the genesis of this panel came about with the article from the aforementioned American Prospect back in April, where he took on the then red hot crisis and issue of the Blake Bailey biography of Philip Roth. The piece was entitled, "Damn the Author, but Don't Cancel the Book." And Eric, you draw a pretty firm line in the sand in terms of saying we can and should discuss bad artists, bad people, but we shouldn't and can't be willy-nilly canceling books. Feel free to talk about what prompted you to write that, and if anything has changed in the last few months.
Well, I take a pretty close absolutist position on that. I'm sorry, we have like an echo. Why is that happening? Well, now I can't hear you. Now you're muted.
I muted myself. Maybe we should mute ourselves when we're not speaking to avoid the echo. Sorry, Eric.
Is that me so am I causing my echo when I speak? No, now it's okay. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I take a pretty close to absolutist position on the art and the artist question that you raised. There's a few reasons for this. One is that, just to start off this discussion, I have a lot of reasons for this, but here's one that maybe we could talk about, which is that the mores of culture change a great deal over time. And different times and places have different views on things. And it would be a shame to lose great works of art over a particular moment, a particularly historical moment in the history of public morality. Say, what would we think today if James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room had been canceled because it had a gay main character? When I teach history of journalism, I like to shock my students. I won't do it here by going into any detail, but I talk to them about ancient Greece and what it and the kinds of things that are described as the most honorable, ideal goals for the parents of a child in ancient Greece, who would then be greeted in the symposium in a way that would now be shocking and horrific to all of us. Just about the worst thing one could imagine, and yet back then, in the height of civilization at that moment, it was fantastic. You'd be bragging about it to your friends and relatives. So that's one reason. The second reason is that I also teach a course at Brooklyn College. I teach literature, even though my PhD is in history, and I really teach literature and history as history. And I tell my students, the reason I do this is because there are certain forms of historical truth that can only be told through literature. They're private. They're in people's minds. They're in people's psyches. They're not articulated in the public world. But they're true. They're true. And this is actually, to bring us back to Philip Roth, this is what he was best at. He was best at giving voice to things that most of us would consider quite shameful, and would be horrified if people knew about us or about our friends or about our children and so forth. And yet it's tremendously important for our understanding of our own world, and also for our acceptance of ourselves, that these things are shared. So the idea that there are objectionable things in literature, or they are written by objectionable people, well, I think we need to be a lot more humble about that, and recognize the enormous benefit of it. Now, I do think there are exceptions, and we can get into that later, but very few. And as the tie always goes to the runner, the difficult decision should always go to freedom of speech and thought.
So Marie, Beth Ann, I think, just using the Bailey as a kind of drop-off point of departure, you don't need to necessarily comment on that, but feel free to either address like your feelings about how that, I think, is kind of a microcosm of sorts of what we're dealing with now, both the blowback but I'd love to hear from you two about either that or just your current take on where we are vis-a-vis cancel culture in 2021. And unmute yourself, Marie.
I agree with everything that Eric has said. I don't think there's anything more precious than freedom of expression, and our freedom to express views, even to the point of difficult truths, perhaps even false information. We need to be a little more nuanced, I think, than we have been. I think these past 10 years, 5 or 10 years, have distressed me in just the anger that's involved and there's sort of resentments and the kind of battles over small things, really, when the thing that is most precious and most important is actually freedom of expression. Of course, the first thing that is done when a totalitarian government takes over is the attempt to create a group think, right? And that's, I mean, the Chinese emperors did it when they took over from empire to empire. The conquistadores, when they went into Mexico, you know, they burned all the Mayans books. And of course, we know that the Nazis, Nazi youth was doing exactly that, burning the books that were considered to be un-German. So for me, you know, there's a long history of this. I mean, we've seen Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses was canceled, we can say censored, canceled. Even today we have books, Mark Twain is on the banned books list in some states for its racial bigotry. We know that there is racism in Huckleberry Finn, but you have to look at these things with a sense of context. Eric wrote a very good article lately, I think it was on our sense of losing the importance of history and the teaching of history, and how in faculties in certain universities, history is no longer important. Well, history is something that does give us context, I think. And in this whole discussion, I mean, you can take Blake Bailey's book on Philip Roth and cancel it because of Blake Bailey's transgression, sexual transgression, or whatever he was accused of. But in the end, you know, there's been in the 50s, there was a long tradition in the new criticism that you divide the writer from the art. I mean, Beth Ann, when she asked me to come on this program, she said, let's talk about bad people who write good books, you know, and that was, and that's the flip side of it, right? There are monstrous people who write great books. Robert Frost was a monstrous husband and father. He wrote some of the most beautiful poetry we have. So that's where I sit, is a little bit more nuance, a little bit more context in the discussion.
I, Sean, want to jump in with a little bit of history. And I will tell you that I lived for some time behind the Berlin Wall. And there is nothing sadder in the history of the world than an East Berlin bookstore with its carefully sanitized versions of history, of wartime, of what is beautiful. Oh, the record albums, you know, what was allowed to be shown as a great example of German culture. But then, you know, over here is Brahms, but let's not put any Bertolt Brecht on the shelves, of course, you know, that sort of thing. And so I really did watch the world wake up from history in that context. And what Marie and Eric are both saying about censorship and freedom of expression, I think is not only key, but it also goes back to a word that Eric used that is so important, and that's humility. When we look at history, when we look at what's come before us, if we don't have, when I talk about humility, I'm not talking about excusing monstrous behavior, excusing enslavement and genocide and all kinds of fascism. I'm talking about seeing what's really within us now. What are we repeating? What are we changing? What are we improving? And what are we not doing well in? And without all of the information, how can we do that? So my question, I think, for all three of you is, how do we make sure everything is available, that we can? Marie has until recently been at the Library of Congress in a place that celebrates every bit of American printed and archived and filmed material and so on and so forth. And we need to have it all available, but we also need to have perspective on it. And Eric, of course, is one of our great people in thinking about that perspective. But when we talk about cancel culture, or we talk about a Blake Bailey or a Philip Roth and so on and so forth, people don't always know all the facts, and they don't know where to go for them. And that's one of the things for me, as someone who's been working in the literary establishment during a time when things have moved into the digital realm, that I worry about, that people are just not going to, we have so much access and yet so little understanding of how to put it together. Is that fair, Eric?
I think so. I have this quality, most people think it's a bad quality, that I don't like too much agreement. I like controversy. That's why my column is called Altercations. Comes from my name. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to try and complicate this discussion in two ways that I would not if people were saying different things. But like I said, there are two ways that I think I can defend, even though they're not the first things I would normally say about this. I said the first things I would normally say. One is, and they're unrelated, so I'm going to throw them out there, and either one can serve as a purpose of discussion. One is actually inspired by what you said about East Berlin. I had a professor when I was a graduate student at Yale named Wolfgang Leonhardt. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he was part of the, he was an East German who then, East German communist, who then became part of the Yugoslavian junta and had people killed before he decided that Tito was a bad guy and moved to the West and became an eminent professor. And he taught a class that I audited actually on history of the Soviet Union. But he said something very interesting, I thought, that I've never forgotten. He said, Lenin took the position that you could only teach Leninist principles in the Soviet Union because everything else was false. And it was pointless to let people teach things that are false. Now, Lenin was not very, he lacked humility among many other things, but he had a point, which is that you can't let people teach false things over and over if you know they're false. There's a corruptive aspect to it, and particularly in positions of power in the culture. So it's nice to say that the marketplace of ideas will sort things out, but it doesn't always sort things out. Would I cancel Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham if I could? I certainly would, because they're lying to people and they're dangerous, and people are not getting vaccinated as a result, and other dangers. They're spreading racist hatred. And so would I, if I owned a bookstore, would I sell their books? No, I would not. I don't want the government necessarily getting involved, although sometimes I do, but by and large I don't. But we have to find a way to privilege truth over falsehood. Ironically, Lenin was privileging falsehood over truth, but he still had a point nevertheless. The second point, which is unrelated, and I usually find myself on the very opposite side of this argument, has to do with Woody Allen. I personally feel, and I feel almost 100% certain that Woody Allen is innocent of the charges having to do with child, what is accused of doing by Mia Farrow and Ronan Farrow. I've studied very carefully. I'm writing a book on the history of American Jewish culture. I feel all right about it. We don't have to fight about it. I know a lot of people disagree. But on the issue of, is Woody Allen a terrible person because of the way that he portrays young women and does his allegedly predatory behavior, but maybe even allegedly is not necessary there, towards young women bleed into his work, and therefore should his work be canceled because we know that he's pushing a point of view that we find to which we morally have strong objections today, even if we didn't have them when the work was originally published. That's a more difficult question. Now, my most recent book, Lying in State, which I feel was murdered by the pandemic. I had the meeting, I had the big publishing meeting at my publisher the same day that the whole staff walked out because Hachette was publishing Little Brown, which is owned by Hachette, as is my publisher, Basic, was publishing Woody Allen's memoir. And they canceled that publication, just as Norton canceled Blake Bailey's book. And I felt that was completely wrong because, you know, Woody Allen, it's a good book, actually, I read it. But anyway, I thought it was wrong for all the reasons we're discussing. And yet, if I were in, I think Norton's decision is indefensible. But in the case of Little Brown, I would say, well, look, somebody else can publish this book. We don't have to publish this book. And we've decided that this book is putting forth a point of view that we find objectionable, given the fact that the man's history is inextricably intertwined in the arguments he's making, and we don't approve of that. You know, there's a publishing in the United States is a private business. I wouldn't want to publish Donald Trump. I wouldn't want to publish any of those people. And it's okay to say, I don't want to be the person to publish this book. Now, in the cases of both Woody Allen and Philip Roth, I think they're ultimately wrong because they had signed contracts to publish the book. Yeah. And they had agreed to publish the book. And once they did that, they had a responsibility. But the question of what is the role of the gatekeepers of culture vis-a-vis morality rather than free speech is a much more complicated one than the one in which we all apparently agree on is there should be free speech, there should be freedom of expression. But you know, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where certain institutions have a great deal of power in that world. And I think we all want that power exercised with as much moral responsibility as possible. And where does that leave us with what we call cancel culture? That's, I think, a very difficult question.
I have a couple of observations that you kicked up for me, Eric. First of all, on the Soviet Union question, you know, some of the greatest literature that has been published out of Russia, aside from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, has been dissident literature that was banned, was censored by the Soviet government. The people their lives were made very difficult. They very often had to leave. I mean, you think of Solzhenitsyn, you think of Vasily Aksyonov, Vladimir Voinovich, Pasternak, just so many wonderful writers who were marginalized and made to suffer. Quite a few of them. I think of Akhmatova, the poet. Yes. Such unbelievable waste in the attempt to control the voice that ultimately got out. And it has always struck me that Russian literature today is nowhere in comparison to those days when they were being avidly read in the secret press, and they were being avidly read outside of the Soviet Union as well. So censorship and sort of canceling and suppression really doesn't work at the end. You know, in the end, it just doesn't work. That was one observation that I have. The other is that, you know, I was actually working at Harcourt Brace when Salman Rushdie's book Satanic Verses came out, and of course that was the great cancellation of all time. The Ayatollah Khomeini saying that this was blasphemy and that he was to be executed. Simply, you know, that scared the publishing world to such an extent that they were hiding the books under the Dalton. I remember B. Dalton canceled all the books being sold in their stores. People were really afraid. There were bombs going off in London in stores that were carrying the book. In some stores in the United States, they had the book under the counter. So unless you asked for it, they were not going to sell it. Tremendous sort of suppression of this voice, which it sort of started a ball rolling, I think. I went on to Simon & Schuster and just at the time when American Psycho was about to be published. And my fellow colleagues at Simon & Schuster objected so much. This is very much the way that we can see the same circumstances today, objected so much they did not want to publish this book. It went right over to Sunny Mehta at Knopf and was published right away, you know, within 24 hours or 48 hours of it being canceled. So the passions that rage, I think, in publishing houses are also a part of the fact that there's such inconsistent policies, right? Because you have Simon & Schuster, which is my publisher, and I love Simon & Schuster and worked for Simon & Schuster at one time, but they refused to publish Josh Hawley's book, right? They canceled that book. At the same time defended publishing Mike Pence's book. So, you know, this is all, as Eric says, a matter of taste. And a matter of you know, they have a right as a commercial enterprise to choose what business they're going to go into. But, you know, there's a lack of consistency somehow. And it seems to be very impetuous, these decisions. And I think that confuses staff. I think it encourages a kind of bad behavior on the part of publishing houses.
Well, and Marie, I think that's actually the tangent that I want to develop. I think I'm not surprised, and I'm relieved that we all are in agreement that censorship is broadly speaking intolerable to anyone with an artistic inclination or believes in democracy. But I think, if I may, I don't think, to be really frank, I don't think we're really talking about the slippery slope of government. And as it relates to cancel culture, I don't think we're worried about government stepping in or publishers unilaterally deciding who gets published. And more to the point, with self-publishing, no one's going to get canceled. It just means you don't have the platform that you used to enjoy. I'm more interested in how this is a cultural moment, and I think it plays out largely on Twitter, and how much of this is being driven by, I won't say hysteria, but a groupthink that is driven by very passionate, albeit maybe misinformed advocates. And I don't want to let the publishers off the hook. I think with the Mike Pence example, publishers are driven by revenue. And so to me, I don't think it's cynical to suggest that even the publishers that are reacting are trying to get ahead of what's going to make them look the least bad. But publishers of all shapes and sizes are very happy to put crap into the world if they think it's going to sell. So I don't think publishers are innocent in any of this. And I think there's actually a lot of cowardice in their willingness to pick their battles. I don't think it's a coincidence that Holly probably wasn't going to sell as many books as Pence. Therefore, that maybe drove that decision. Am I barking up the wrong tree, or does anyone agree? I know you don't need to agree, but this is at once more complicated than what we're talking about, but maybe also less complicated?
Well, I just want to add one thing in that is fair along the simple lines and talking about publishing right now. And I do eventually, I think Eric mentioned we're going to get back to, really, really bad author behavior. But in the publishing realm, it reminds me right now of academia, where the stakes are smallest, the voices are the loudest, right? So here is the thing. The other day, I saw some notice somewhere that Chip and Joanna Gaines, the Magnolia Home couple, which is so anti-literary. I mean, let's face it, they're all about, their Target line and their magazine and everything. Not only are they going to have their own app, not only are they going to have their own DIY channel, but they have their own publishing company now. And I thought, here we are, the big publishers are we down to the big three yet? Or is it still big four, Marie? I don't know. It's not very many anymore. So literary publishing, publishing of great fiction, nonfiction, memoir, poetry is, like just running up the walls of the ivory tower, while there are these opportunities in the media and starting publishing companies, magazine and book, that people are just able to do with venture capital, right? And of course, money always comes from somewhere. I'm not going after the VCs, but what I am saying is that the establishment is changing so rapidly that sometimes I wonder how we can even wrap our heads around where publishing should be putting its energy and its money and where it shouldn't. I think a lot of people in the book publishing industry are very worried and will give a contract to whomever is going to keep the rest of the ships afloat. I don't know, maybe I'm being a little bit of a brat, but
I see the problem differently, and I see the problem as Sean defined it differently. It's true, my last book on the history of presidential lying, which a quarter of which is about Donald Trump. It's true that if Basic Books had said, Eric, we disapprove of you for some reason, or we don't really want to get in trouble with the Trump administration, so we're canceling your contract and you owe us the money back, even if you don't. And as your friend Sean says, you're free to self-publish. Go right ahead. No one's censoring you. I would beg to differ. I would say that there's a certain number of ways that one can be published and be heard in this country. And self-publishing, it's a very rare thing that anyone self-publishes and gets heard. There are examples, but it's very rare. The thing about the internet, the promise of the internet was that it was going to democratize free speech and anyone would have a voice. But in fact, 90% of what people see and hear on the internet is controlled by just a few corporations. And it hasn't really helped with that problem at all. So I think we need to take seriously the role. I mean, publishers, on the one hand, they're commercial entities, and on the other hand, they're guardians of our culture. And they have a responsibility other than just making money. And sometimes they're faced with difficult decisions. Now, to get back to bad behavior on both the part of Blake Bailey, but also his publisher, they handled that situation terribly. They got this email from a woman who said that Bailey had raped her. And as far as I understand, the only thing he did was show it to Bailey, and he said, "No, I didn't rape anybody." And they didn't try and reach out to the woman or get any details of it. They just let the whole thing go, and then they were humiliated when these brave women came forward after the book had been published. And so they ran away from the problem by canceling the book. They made one mistake in the first place and one mistake in the second place. Neither one was well considered. And they just really, I guess, imagined, hoped the thing would go away. I went rather easy on them in my column, I thought, because Norton is really one of the very few non-conglomerated publishers.
Yeah.
And I care about their survival. It's a tough business for them. And they publish a lot of good books, and I didn't want to pile on them, but I do think that the decision-making process there was incredibly irresponsible, both in the case of the book itself. It's I'm quite critical of that book, but it has a lot of valuable research in it that will be of use to people like me who are relying on a lot of that things a lot of it for the book I'm working on now on the history of American Jewish culture, post-war American Jewish culture, and other people I know in my field. And so I think we have to take seriously the power that publishers have in our culture. It's just the same way we have to take seriously the power that Ivy League universities have in our culture. So if they're going to cancel a speaker because students object, their feelings are being hurt, they're not feeling safe in the presence of views that they don't like, I think it's a problem. I think we need to talk about it. I didn't like the way the New York Times handled Josh Hawley's op-ed. I didn't really get that people on the staff felt that it made them unsafe. I mean, I'm not Black, okay? There's a lot of things I don't understand. I lived a privileged life. I'm a white male. The fact even that I'm saying that, on the one hand, it's true and it's relevant. On the other hand, I have to say that because that always comes up in discussions like this, that certain voices these days are they're not quite canceled, but they're diminished. And there's an argument for that. And I'm not talking about white males. I'm talking about particularly. I'm just saying that I've always felt strongly that arguments and works of art should rise and fall strictly on their own merits, regardless of how terrible the person is or how representative that person is. And that's not the world we live in anymore. And that raises a whole set of questions that I'm uncomfortable with, but again, I like to cause trouble, so I hope I'm causing something.
Well, Eric, I have questions, but I want to see if Marie can respond to what you were just saying about art being judged purely on its own merits, because Marie, you did bring up the new criticism in the 1950s. And, of course, it's not the 1950s anymore, but many people who are working in literature today learned, at least if they were not schooled in new criticism, learned about new criticism and do care, as Eric was saying, about the integrity of a work of art on its own merits. I also, in graduate school, was schooled in new historicism, which I thought was so important because it lets you know when a work of art is telling the truth or not. And as Marie pointed out, and I'll go over to you in a second, Marie, earlier, sometimes a work of art can say something false and there's a reason for it. That is not, I'm not saying art has to be perfect truth or perfect anything. I'm just saying that there are all of these things to consider. So Marie, now, Eric mentioned that book publishers have responsibilities other than making money. And I'm not going to say all of us believe that. I know that I do. I know that I believe in being a book critic because I want to take part in a discourse, not just recommend things that people are buying and selling. So talk to me about those responsibilities and about art on its own merits.
Well, you're so right, Beth Ann. I think that, first of all, we have to realize that publishing is a very subjective business and a very transient business in the sense that tastes ebb and flow, and there's a great deal of redundancy because something works and then everybody tries to do the same thing. It is as subjective, I suppose, as academia, which is hugely subjective. So you have these two things feeding each other. Basically, I worked for two companies, Harcourt and Simon & Schuster, before I came to the Washington Post and the Library of Congress. And I have to say that in both of those publishing houses, the trade departments were not always all about money. I mean, there are certain aspects that were considered sort of the jewels of the trade. You do, Alice Mayhew and her wonderful nonfiction books that sometimes they, sold the roof off the house. They were so successful, and other times they were done because they were noble good works and didn't sell. And somehow, the balance comes out. You pay $6 billion to Ronald Reagan, and it sells 20,000 copies, but this unknown person comes along and then makes that work. So there's a lot of kind of sort of juju going on in publishing, and we all know it, just as there is a lot of juju going on in academia as well.
Spelled J-U, not J-E-W.
That's a good thing.
Right.
Thank you for.
I'm talking Yoruba here,
We're talking about Philip Roth.
Yeah. So there's, and I think you have to let that happen in a way. I mean, editors go, editors come. They all have different tastes. Things get published. Things get passed by. I think the beauty of it. I mean, we could all rail against the injustices of publishing, but I think the beauty of it is, in so many ways, it's unpredictability.
But what do you think then about the walkout of the staff of Hachette that then really bullied the house into dropping Woody Allen? That wasn't the taste of the editors was overruled.
I agree. I think it was terrible. I think it was,
But it worked.
and I feel the same way about Junot Diaz as you feel about Woody Allen when Junot was accused of aggressive kissing.
Yeah.
And MIT stood by him, the Pulitzer Board stood by him, but boy, the social media fury was intense. And I mean, this writer had to step out for 2 years, 3 years, just to let things calm down. there are mistakes made also in the process of the social media. And I think Woody Allen is one. I mean, there's no justification for canceling that book. Absolutely not. It makes me sad to think of the days. I mean, when I was going to high school and you joined the debate club and you were taught to debate the other side, right? So you would have to learn the other side, learn what that was like, see what those points might be, and maybe gain something from it. And I think that should be the university experience. It should be the intellectual experience. We should imagine ourselves on the other side. There's so little tolerance these days. And I think that this is all a part of, cancel culture is all a part of that lack of tolerance.
But
Yeah.
are there things that we can't abide? Are there things that we have to say, this is too much? For instance, I was just looking at, before we all came on, the article, I believe it was in the New Yorker, about Flannery O'Connor's letters, especially in her younger life. She was a terrible bigot. That doesn't mean that her work isn't great, but personally, she was really quite I don't know. I all the words I'm thinking of are words that I shouldn't use to describe a woman, like termagant. So that's my bad. But it's true that she was incredibly intolerant of other races. And as Eric was saying earlier about about Woody Allen, we know that these things that she held influenced the way she wrote and what she wrote about. But sometimes it doesn't affect the work, and sometimes it does. Am I articulating this well enough, Sean? You can rephrase.
Well, I don't know whether it was Marie or Eric, but somebody used the word humility earlier, and I think that's what's been lost in terms of our critical engagement and our cultural discourse. I feel like these battles used to be fought largely by intellectuals and artists themselves, which include the book reviewers. And what I'm maybe trying to get at is, I think these battles are largely, if not partially, being led by people with no skin in the game. I don't know how many people take to Twitter to protest Woody Allen or Philip Roth biography that are writers themselves or really care one way or the other about reading the book. There's a certain groupthink that I don't think we can describe or remedy. But I think without Twitter and social media, these battles would remain small and provincial. And now they dominate the culture. But I think the long view is, I think politicians prove this, especially in our info overload 24/7, floodgate of content. And Junot Diaz is a great exception, Marie, because I think for the most part, people sit it out for a few days and then we move on to the next outrage. So I would advise, caution and patience, because most writers, if they get caught up in a controversy, it's going to blow over. So I guess I'm not as worried about this is the way of the future and cancel is going to be the new normal. I wonder if less people start using Twitter, that some of these fires put themselves out.
No, Sean, I think what's new about this, and you put your finger right next to it, almost on it, is the role of social media and the mob that appears out of social media. I think that accounts for the panic in Norton and maybe also for the panic at Hachette. And that's new and it's dangerous because it's not dangerous. Like, I've done a few things which if they were published on social media, I'd have the same problem you're describing, I suppose, for a couple of days or a week or so.
Right.
But my career, the next book I wrote or the next class I taught, I would be much more cautious in what I said. I'm a lot more cautious in my classes now than I used to be. Even though just because I don't want the things I say to be misunderstood, taken out of context and blown up.
Right.
And I have tenure. People don't have tenure, have to be a lot more cautious than I do.
Right.
And I've written 11 books, so I have a track record. So I could probably survive a misunderstanding. But young people who are starting out, who have something to say, they don't have that luxury. And that's what our culture was losing on the basis of the cowardice of the gatekeepers. in the face of the social mob. So I think it's very important for people who have a voice and can stand up to it to do so. And that's we're not getting much support in that room.
Marie Beth Ann, I think I agree. Now we're really, getting into the lane of what is our role, or what are the people that really care. And I say skin in the game, but I guess I mean that metaphorically in the sense of people that really care. People that cared about books 10 years ago, they're going to care about books 10 years from now and want the health of the industry. And that includes music and movies, et cetera. How do we grapple? Because Eric, I appreciate your point is well taken, that I'm talking broadly about, the Twitter brouhahas, rise and fall. But what you're talking about, when that spills over to authors being canceled or walkouts impacting the publication of a book, we have crossed a line that didn't used to exist. And there are people on the sidelines when they see that saying, we need more of that.
But I remember 30 years ago, and I don't remember his name. Marie may be able to provide it, but I remember a friend of mine in graduate school had worked as an undergraduate at Dartmouth with Louise Erdrich and her husband. Remember Louise's husband? Yep. And many people don't, and no one reads his work anymore because he was a pedophile. I'm not sure if this is alleged. I don't know if this is true, but I just remember.
I hope he's dead.
Is he? Is Michael dead? Okay.
No, I said I hope he is, because otherwise he might be slandering.
He might well be. I'm not sure, but we don't talk about him. We don't, and at the time in the early 90s, they were like the up and coming lit couple, and both tremendously talented, and for very good reason. He is now gone. And so there's a difference, I know, between canceling discourse and canceling truly reprehensible behavior. And I
disagree with that, by the way, 100%.
Okay,
I don't care if he's a pedophile, if his work is good. He should go to jail if he's a pedophile, but his work should rise and fall on its own.
And I have to clarify that I don't think people stopped reading Michael because he was a pedophile. I think they stopped reading Michael because it was very, very apparent that Louise was doing all the writing. And Michael was not the talented person that he was representing himself to be. I mean, he was a controlling author who didn't give Louise any credit. And then I think it became clear to everybody that she was the talented one.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah.
So I think that's true. I think the social media world has changed everything. It is very difficult to shake something like that. You can imagine shake something like the absolute sort of plummeting of your reputation if something is insinuated even. And not an accusation not fully made, even just an insinuation. And not always does it have to do with a person's character. I mean, when we look at the experience with American Dirt, right? Janine, what was her name? Janine Cummins.
Yes.
Who wrote American Dirt. She's had every right to write a book about, a Mexican woman coming across the border. She has every right to do it. The publisher, Flatiron, had every right to publish it. But the social media flurry was enormous. It was basically, how can this woman who is white tell the story of an indigenous Mexican migrant in the most difficult circumstances? And the reaction was nasty. And I have to say, even I am a Latina, and I'm, that for me, it was, she got a lot of money for this book. The question really was, what it brought up to my mind was that if Latino writers, Latinx writers are being published in great volume and being paid lots of money, nobody would have whimpered or made an accusation, or there would be no social media flurry.
Well, there was a couple of things. Oh, sorry, Marie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so there are times when that sort of something is revealed in the process. I also think when, what's her name? Amanda Gorman, was having her poem translated in Europe, right? And there was this whole big thing about she could not be translated by somebody who was not Black. And the European publishers had selected white translators, and there was this huge uproar on social media about representation. And so to some extent, I mean, it may be foolish, it may not be, but it provokes the question, right? And that's not a bad thing in discourse and in the
no, and it's not. And that's what I wanted to say about American Dirt. Miriam Gorba, who wrote Mean, and who wrote a very long piece about American Dirt, pointed out two things that have not left my mind since. And it's not about the writing. As you said, Janine Cummins had every right to write a book, to imagine herself. The marketing department made a couple of terrible errors. One, and I'm sure you've read about this, is that at the book launch luncheon, they chose to put centerpieces with blue roses surrounded by barbed wire. Yeah. Which a lot of people objected to. But the thing I thought that was really problematic there, and this is about what we've all been saying about the truth, is they marketed Cummings as, I'm saying it incorrect, Cummins, as the wife of an immigrant. And a lot of people—
Undocumented immigrant.
Yes, undocumented immigrant. He's Irish. And I think they use that a little bit to their advantage, but what's a marketing department for if it doesn't use something to its advantage? So people saw that and thought, oh, they're trying to pull one over on us, where it was really, I think, just, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on that marketing department in particular. They all make mistakes. All of us make mistakes. But I think sometimes the uproar on social media that we've been discussing gets stoked by things like that. And all we have to do is say, did you like American Dirt? Did she do a good job of reaching you as a reader? Did she bring up compassion and empathy for you? Okay, fine, you liked it or you didn't like it. It doesn't have to be judged as the entire world of Mexico and migration in between two covers.
Well, I think so. I think some contours have emerged. Not that we needed to, or that I desired that, but I think we've established that censorship is not good, has never been good. But I think getting back to the notion of humility, and I don't know how we resolve this, but I just think most critics or most people that had an academic or artistic background are cognizant of the fact that if you look at the life of anyone, posthumously or contemporary, your bookshelves and your music collection would be exceedingly limited if you judged the work by what the person was like. And I think that's maybe what is as simple as that seems. It's the most profound disconnect in terms of how we're assessing, especially people who've already lived and died. I think that's where I draw a line and say the music or the book speaks for itself, as it should. And the discourse can contain discussions and revisions in terms of how we teach or embrace. But the work, as Eric has said a few times, ultimately has to speak for itself. And that's what worries me about how we are, as a culture, redefining how we let people enter out of the canon, or what's even worthy of discussion.
Well, we're both with women and minorities. We're rethinking our whole history, right? The way that certain cultures, women are more than half the population, but they've been either kept out or erased or misportrayed in ways that are complementary to the dominant culture, which is what white male, mostly Christian, not entirely. And so we're trying to figure out how to address that, and that's good. But the problem is we don't know where the lines are. We don't know how far to go. A lot of people, not a lot, but I imagine, as with Junot Diaz, a number of people who were basically innocent got railroaded during the Me Too moment a couple of years ago, and it could happen again. And people who made comments that, felt reasonable to everyone in the room were then published and were demonized as a result. Okay, those are discussions we can have, and we can make progress, and we should make progress, and we are making progress. The thing is that because of social media, the discussion loses all nuance, and it's like this railroad. It's like this train that is on a runaway track, and it can't be stopped. And what the publishers do, because they're thinking finances, is they just try and extricate themselves from it as quickly as they can to try to limit the damage. And yet the result of that is that the mob wins. And it's not just publishing, it's also true I'm a professor, I've seen it at a lot of universities in the same situation. Now, to be fair, Donald Trump and the Republican Party are a much bigger threat than anything we've been talking about, 100 times worse, okay? But there is a sort of woke test of certain works of art and certain viewpoints that says, and I guess it happened, I only read about American Dirt, I didn't read the book. But on the one hand, absolutely, anybody can write about anything. On the other hand, people are saying, we have been silenced, we have been misrepresented for centuries, we've suffered as a result, people have been killed, we can't make a living, we can't, we've been the victims of prejudice. And who do they pick to tell our story? A nice white woman, like always? It's infuriating, I get that too. So where is the line on that? The line is not in issuing death threats and canceling speeches. Obviously, we're all against that. But where is the line? And that's where you need nuance and complication and conversations like this one. And yet we're not going to get there. So what do we do?
Yeah, and I would remind that it's not just in books and in writing that this is happening. It's happening in music too. I mean, you remember when Kitty Kelly's book came out on Frank Sinatra, and nobody wanted to hear Frank Sinatra for a while because it was, he was a horrible human being in so many ways. And now, of course, Placido Domingo has been accused of being a little too amorous on stage. And so now he's not allowed to perform in the United States of America. So, this is, it's the arts in general. It's
Yes.
suffering this passage. I hope we get over it.
Oh, we need to talk more about it. We need more conversations like this one. And Sean, I know that we have to end, and I'm hoping you're going to sum things up a bit for us, but I also hope that we'll be able to continue talking about this in, at 1455 and in other places as well, because it's time for people to actually talk about both sides instead of just one side.
Yeah, I'll suggest that I think what we've all articulated in our own way is, and again, it's simple, and yet I think it's incredibly profound. What the biggest casualty of this kind of current moment, if we want to call this extended cultural moment, is the shutdown, the willful shutdown of discourse. That's what ultimately suffers. And I think whether you're talking about the American experiment or the democratic ideal, or the life of art and literature and music, having these discussions is where it should take place, whether it's in a bar or in a chat room. But the force or the groupthink that's saying these topics are off limits, that artist is off limits, I think we're all in agreement that that is not the way forward. And I think I would simply say, I do think we will emerge. I don't think the trend we're on is going to intensify to the extent that discourse is shut down, but I certainly would be an advocate for saying, why don't we all take a step back and have the courage of your convictions, discuss it and debate it, and win or lose the argument, or choose not to support that book or that artist, but you can't make the decision for somebody else. Any other closing thoughts? I would welcome any final thoughts. And unfortunately, we are running close on time. I certainly could enjoy talking about this for hours.
Well, I just had one thought while both of you were just speaking now, which is the problem is it's an ironic problem, but the problem is that the best place to have these conversations is either in a university seminar room or at a author's book reading.
You bet.
And that's exactly what we're losing
Right.
because of these things.
Exactly.
So again, I would say that those of us in a position to make a stand owe it to our good fortune to make that stand.
Well said.
Agreed. And listen, shameless pitch, but in our own exceedingly modest and humble way, 1455 exists to provide a platform for this discussion. We talk about our mission, which is we celebrate creativity and we want to build communities through the discussion of storytelling. So I don't mention that to say, so we're doing it, but I think there's where I find hope. If you want to have these discussions, sponsor them, encourage them. And I agree, Eric, completely that it is incumbent upon anyone who has any interest in these matters to get involved. No one can afford to be aloof. Again, culturally or artistically, there are casualties. And I think we can help kind of ameliorate it from getting a little bit out of hand. So perhaps as an open invitation, we can revisit this at some point in the future and check in and see where we are 6-12 months from now. If things have cooled off a little or they've heated up, I'm sure we'll have more thoughts on the matter. So let me thank you all, Beth Ann, Marie, Eric, a true honor. And as I said at the outset, and I'm happy to repeat, huge fan of all of your work. So a tremendous honor for me to glean some insights. I really appreciate it. And again, you're welcome at 1455 anytime to discuss these things. And thank you for checking this panel out. We appreciate you checking out our festival this weekend. Let us know what you think. Let us know what topics you wish we were addressing, and we will stimulate more discussion. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.